Homelander looks like Superman. He flies, he's invincible, he's beloved by the public, plastered on billboards as the world's greatest protector. But underneath the cape is one of the most psychologically damaged characters on television. Not because he's evil by nature, but because he was never given the one thing every developing mind actually needs in order to become a functional adult: genuine, unconditional love. Homelander wasn't born into a family. He was grown in a lab and raised inside a corporate facility, monitored, tested, and conditioned from birth by people whose job was to produce a marketable asset, not raise a person. There was no mother's comfort, no consistent caregiver, no safety net of any kind. Just handlers optimizing him for performance, running him through evaluations the way you'd stress test a product before shipping it. In developmental psychology, this maps almost exactly onto what's called attachment theory. The idea that a child's earliest bonds with a caregiver shape their entire future capacity for trust, emotional regulation, and self-worth. Kids who form secure attachments in infancy generally grow into adults who can handle rejection, tolerate distress, and form stable relationships. Kids who don't form that bond at all, not an unhealthy one, but literally none, tend to struggle with all three for the rest of their lives. Homelander is the most extreme version of that second case imaginable. He didn't have a bad attachment figure. He had zero attachment figures, just evaluation. This isn't a minor backstory detail. It's the entire engine of his character. A child who is never held, soothed, or comforted doesn't just grow up sad. They grow up without the internal architecture needed to process fear, failure, or rejection in a healthy way. Because that architecture is built through years of a caregiver consistently showing up. Homelander skipped that developmental stage entirely, and nothing in his adult life ever goes back to repair it. What Homelander got instead of love was conditioning. Praise when he performed. Correction, punishment, or cold indifference when he showed weakness or failed a test. The people raising him treated affection as a lever to pull, not a genuine bond to build. So Homelander learns, very early, that love is transactional. You get approval when you're useful, powerful, impressive. You get discarded, disciplined, or ignored when you're not. This creates a pattern psychologists associate with extreme cases of childhood neglect, a person who craves love intensely, almost desperately, but has no functional model for how to receive or reciprocate it. He wants to be adored, but doesn't know how to be close to anyone, because closeness was never modeled for him, only performance and reward. So adoration from a distance becomes the substitute. A stadium full of strangers chanting his name feels to him like the closest available version of being loved, because it's the only version of being wanted he was ever actually taught. This also explains his fixation on being seen as a savior, a hero, a father figure to the public. It's not really about heroism. It's a starving attempt to get from an audience of millions the one-on-one affection he was denied from the handful of people who were supposed to give it to him as a child. Here's what makes Homelander different from an ordinary neglected child growing into a damaged adult. He has literally unchecked physical power. Most people who grow up emotionally stunted still have to live inside a world with consequences. Social feedback, relationship boundaries, other people's willingness to walk away. Those pressures, uncomfortable as they are, often force at least partial growth over time. Homelander doesn't have that pressure. He can do almost anything, to almost anyone, and the only real constraint on him is external. Corporate handlers managing his public image, not any internal sense of limits. So the underlying wound never gets tested, challenged, or corrected. A normal person with attachment damage might, over years of difficult relationships, slowly absorb healthier patterns through trial and error. Homelander instead gets admiration, fear, and control. Three responses from other people that reinforce his damage rather than heal it. Power doesn't just fail to fix his psychology. It actively insulates him from ever being forced to develop one that works. Publicly, Homelander performs warmth, the reassuring smile, the protector of the people branding, the rehearsed humility in interviews and press conferences. But it's a performance built directly on top of unmet, childlike needs, validation, safety, being wanted for who he is, rather than for what he can do for someone. Watch closely and the mask slips constantly. Flashes of rage surface the moment he's criticized or made to feel small. He makes increasingly desperate bids for approval from people who clearly fear him rather than love him, seemingly unable to tell the difference, or unwilling to admit there is one. There's an almost pitiable confusion underneath the menace, a sense that he genuinely doesn't understand why he can't just be cared for the way he imagines ordinary people are cared for. He has never been given the tools to ask for that in a way that doesn't come out as control, intimidation, or manipulation. This is the uncomfortable core of the character. Homelander isn't simply a monster for the sake of being one. He's what happens when someone with the emotional development of a severely neglected child is never forced to grow past it, and is instead handed a level of power that guarantees he never will. Homelander isn't really a commentary on superheroes, even though that's the surface layer. He's a commentary on what happens when unconditional love is replaced entirely by conditional performance from birth, and when the person that damage happens to is never held accountable in any way that could correct it. Strip away the cape and the powers, and what's left is a case study in attachment failure taken to its most extreme, most unregulated conclusion. A person raised to believe love has to be earned through spectacle, who never once got to simply be held. He's frightening not because he's powerful. He's frightening because his damage was entirely preventable, entirely human in its origin, and only becomes catastrophic because of the one thing that should never have been handed to someone raised this way: the ability to act on it without consequence. Homelander is an extreme case, but the mechanism underneath him isn't rare at all. Plenty of people grow up learning that love is something you earn through performance rather than something freely given. Most don't get superpowers on top of it, but the underlying pattern is worth recognizing because it shows up in far more ordinary lives than his. First, notice if you were praised mainly for achievement and rarely just for existing. If approval in your life has always felt conditional, tied to grades, performance, being impressive, it's worth asking whether you've internalized the same belief Homelander has, that you're only worth loving when you're delivering something. Second, watch for using admiration as a substitute for closeness. Public validation, likes, applause, being impressive to a crowd, these can feel like connection, but they're not the same thing. If you find yourself chasing being admired more than being known, that's worth sitting with rather than chasing further. Third, pay attention to how you handle criticism. Homelander cannot tolerate being told no or being made to feel small because his entire sense of self was built on performance and control. If small criticisms feel like existential threats, it's often a sign that self-worth is resting on something too conditional: output, image, control, rather than something steadier. And last, power, status, or success will never retroactively fix an unmet emotional need. Homelander has more power than anyone on the show, and it solves nothing. If anything, it isolates him further from the thing he actually wants. Real repair for this kind of wound usually comes from consistent, unconditional relationships, the very thing that's hardest to build once you've learned not to trust it. Homelander is a warning dressed up as a superhero story. Unlimited power doesn't heal what unconditional love never got the chance to.